white man to be preaching on Black History Month. It's not new. I do that every year. But I've always done it to basically white congregations. And for me as a white man to be talking to a largely African American congregation is different. But it isn't just an African American congregation, it's a mixed congregation. And what I might preach to one person is different than what I might preach to a different person. Not that the truth varies, but the need for the truth varies. Amen. And I have a big disclaimer that part of my anxiety this week came over what kind of words I would use this morning, because words matter. When I was in junior high school and first became aware of race, Negro was the term that used by my friends Phyllis Coxa, Herman Bain, and Herman's brothers, Lucius. And the one I know the most, just lost my memory right here. But Negro was the word they used to describe themselves. And then I got to college and my roommates used black to identify themselves. That was the age of articulate black power in America. And as the years went by, they started shifting and some started calling themselves Afro-Americans. And then, colored was never a part of my vocabulary. That was not a term that was used in the community. I'm sure it was, yeah. And somehow Afro-American morphed into African-American, which seems to be the politically correct thing in the society at large today. And I know that there are in this congregation people who identify themselves as black and others who don't like use of that term. Same may be the case for each of those other labels. Labels are dangerous. Because of my personal experience with my junior high friends, my college roommates, my coworkers, my relatives, black is the term that I'm going to be using today, and for those who are offended by that, I mean you no disrespect. I hope that you can listen beyond the label and hear the love, hear the word of God among us. Last year in Charlottesville, Virginia, one person lost her life and at least 19 were injured when a driver rammed his car through a crowd of people who were gathered to demonstrate against white supremacists. Last year, a radicalized Muslim ran down 8 innocent people on a bike path while praising Allah. Last year, a 47-year-old man slammed a vehicle into worshipers as they left prayer meetings at a Muslim welfare house. Last year, a man stalked the streets of downtown Fresno, fatally shooting 3 people of a different race. Hatred is alive and well and walking the streets of the parts of the world that we call civilized. But we have to keep in mind that Charlottesville and all of these others are simply symptoms, and we are called upon by God to deal with the cause. Amen. The cause is hatred. The cause is bias. The cause is racism. Those things have been empowered in our society and taken from the margins and brought somehow into the mainstream. It is all idolatry. All idolatry. I was a little worried this morning. I found out that Eleanor Johnson had an elephant collection. My mother-in-law, who lived with us, had an elephant collection. And I asked to borrow one of her elephants to put up here to celebrate the African roots. And I had thought about preaching the whole sermon on the strength and the gentleness, the wisdom and the memory of the elephant as a model for Christian discipleship. But I realize there are some who might be afraid that we're worshiping the elephant. And remember the golden calf. The golden calf was in Africa, I think, if I remember right. We aren't worshiping the elephant, we're praising God who gave us the elephant and offering it up as one of those gifts that makes our life wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Idolatry is taking some piece of the creation and lifting up and exalting it above the God of all white on black, black on white, Christian on Jew and Muslim, Muslim on Jew and Christian, Jew on Palestinian, regardless of race or religion, perpetrator or victim. All of these are symptoms of an epidemic disease that is infecting the human race. Some call it racism, some call it chauvinism, some call it tribalism, but whatever one calls it is idolatry, and it is a hateful sin against the will of Almighty God. All of the atrocities that I referred to grow out of the perverse tendency of seeing things from only the perspective of my family, or my faith, or my skin color, or some other group that I happen to belong to. And we all do it. We are all sinners. In the stories that I mentioned above, only half of the perpetrators and victims were identified by the group that they belonged to. And yet, if I were to talk to you later in the week and ask the race of or religion of one of the people in one of those stories, you probably would have filled in the blank and decided the race or the religion of that individual. And how you filled it in, or how I would fill it in, would be a reflection of our own group and our own experience, but not necessarily a reflection of the reality. I find it interesting that in all of those cases that I named above, only one of the perpetrators was called radicalized. That was the Muslim. The white perpetrator, the black perpetrator, the Jewish perpetrator, they aren't named radicalized. We have decided which group we're going to villainize at this point in history. And that's the group that we turn into villains, radicals, evil. We all belong to particular groups, and we see the world through the lenses of those groups. If I say, Lone Ranger, what kind of bullets did he have? Silver. What color hat did he wear? White. What color horse did he ride? What color skin did he have? Oh, did he? Did he? Did he lose an important piece of his stomach? Very strange. Bass, and I can't remember his last name. I have these senior moments. Was a slave living in Texas who fled to Oklahoma. Before it was Oklahoma, it was the Indian Territory. And there he lived among the Indians, and there he learned the languages of several different Indian peoples. And when he was emancipated by the Emancipation Proclamation, he moved out of the Indian Territory. And when Indian Territory was turned into Oklahoma, and a person was appointed to become the sheriff, or the marshal of the territory, he was told to recruit 200 people to be deputy marshals. And Bass was one of the first recruited, because he knew the Indians and he knew their language and he had their respect. By the time he retired, he was credited with arresting over 2,000 criminals. If I had my notes, I could tell you how many he had killed in self-defense. One of the greatest lawmen of the American West was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, and he was black. Why did he get whitewashed? Why did he get whitewashed? I'll tell you why he got whitewashed. He got whitewashed because the person who writes history creates the history that they write. Candace and I went to the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, and there is an entry to the temple that has these 4 large bas-relief murals about battles that the Pharaoh had fought in. And the Pharaoh had these murals carved, and they extolled the victories he had over 4 neighboring nations. And a few years later, after that Pharaoh was gone, a new Pharaoh came, and he didn't like his predecessor being credited with all these war things, so he had the name chiseled out, and his name chiseled in. George Washington didn't fight the Revolutionary War. It was Abraham Lincoln. But time went on, and that Pharaoh died, and another Pharaoh died, and he didn't like someone else being credited for greatness. So he had the names plastered over and his name put in. It wasn't Abraham Lincoln. It was John Kennedy. And the people accepted this. The people accepted this. Hatshepsut was the wife of a pharaoh. When the pharaoh died, his son was too young to take over, so she decided to take over. But they couldn't have a woman pharaoh in Egypt, so she simply had the priests make up a story about how she was a man, even though she was the wife of one pharaoh and the mother of another pharaoh. And she wore a phony beard. The male pharaohs did too. And her cartouche had the symbol for being a male on it every place except one. At the top of the obelisk that she had erected at the temple of Karnak, her cartouche appears with the symbol of a woman, where only the gods would be able to know the truth. The people who write the history create the history. The people who were the producers and the writers for the Lone Ranger were writing for their children, who were white. Who invented the light bulb? Thomas Jefferson. Not Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Edison. Louis Latimer. Give this man an A and a gold star on his Sunday school chart. Louis Latimer did not invent the light bulb. Thomas Edison did, and it didn't work because he used paper filaments that wouldn't last long enough to do anybody any good. But Louis Latimer, who had been a draftsman for that other great inventor, this is terrible. Alexander, could you come preach this? You got it. You got it. I think Candace shipped him a copy of my sermon and he studied for the exam. Good job. He was working for Alexander Graham Bell, but at the same time he was doing his own research, and he learned how to make a carbon filament that would last long enough to do some good. So why do we have a lamp that works here? Because a black man invented the filament that really made it work for us. Why does Thomas Edison get the credit? Because, well, yeah, he came up with the idea overall, and he gets some credit for it. Why doesn't Latimer get some credit? Because Thomas Edison does. Because the history was written by white people for white people about white people.
Amen.
I heard a news report this week. You may have heard it. Did you hear about the airline crew, the pilot and the co-pilot and the two cabin attendants were all black women on a major commercial flight for the first time in history. Why is that important? It's important because if we think the Lone Ranger was white when he was really black, black kids don't grow up with that model. They don't grow up with those dreams in the same way white kids do. For the first time in history, 4 black women were the exclusive crew on a commercial air flight. I have a niece, sort of, from Africa who is a flight attendant for an airline. And I'm sure when she heard that report, she thought, yes! And when I heard that report, I thought, yes. We're dream making. We're dream making for the future. We're taking the deficiencies of the past, and creating the sufficiencies of the future. In the scripture lesson this morning, the Old Testament lesson, it's talking about the passing of the prophet Elijah. Elijah's about to die. His disciple Elisha knows that. Doesn't want anyone to talk about it. Wants to stay in denial. No, this isn't going to happen. It isn't going to happen. It isn't going to happen. But finally they get to the Jordan River, and we all know what crossing the Jordan River means. It means it's time to go. It's time to leave the promised land and go to the whatever's beyond. And Elijah asks Elisha, his disciple, what he wants. And Elisha says, I want a double portion of your spirit. A double portion of your spirit. And Elijah, who knows the pain and the suffering of being a spokesperson for God, who is eternal, says, you are asking a hard thing, friends. You are taking on a job that you can't begin to imagine. But Elijah says, if you can stick with me to the end, if you see me when I'm carried up, what you have asked, you'll be given. And sure enough, the chariots of fire, the horses of fire come and take the prophet away into the heavens, and Elisha is left behind. There's an important message in that for us. Elijah has been a prophet, wise and powerful. Elisha doesn't want to lose Elijah. But if he's going to lose Elijah, Elisha wants what Elijah provided. Wants that spirit. Wants that power. Wants the joy of knowing that he's speaking on behalf of the eternal. He wants to hold on to the past. He can't dream of building the future without holding on to the past. Grace Church has done something remarkable in the last few months. We put together some of the leaders of our church to work on a proposal to the annual conference to get a grant to help us pay for a full-time pastor into the future. Don't you wish we'd gotten that a year ago, Larry? It's good to have you with us this morning. And Greg led that process, and Carol jerked me into the 21st century, teaching me how to do simultaneous computer work online with a bunch of different people. God had wanted me to know how to do that. He wouldn't have me born in the middle of the 20th century, I think. But we sat and we puzzled and we pondered and we met with leaders of the congregation and we asked what people wanted and what they desired. And there were some people that wanted this and some people that wanted that. And we somehow wove that together into a proposal which Sonia and I took to the annual conference board of church development last Tuesday. They loved our proposal. They loved our proposal. But you can't have a group of Methodists where everybody loves everything, can you? So one of the superintendents said, Melvin, says here you're going to triple your membership in a couple of years. Do you think that's realistic? And God sent an angel, a prophet of the Almighty, and Sonia said, with God all things are possible. Ain't she wonderful? Ain't she wonderful? And then because I'm seminary trained, I threw out a whole bunch of other words as to why I thought it might be possible. But she spoke the truth. She spoke the truth. We have proposed to triple our membership and to spread our presence throughout the Rainier Valley in the years ahead. We celebrate that. We celebrate that, but we won't be doing it alone. We'll be doing it with God, and we'll be doing it with all of God's agents, all of the disciples who come to gather around us to help us on our way. It's always been the case. This church wouldn't be here if we had not been a part of the Methodist Connection. It wouldn't have been started. It wouldn't have been perpetuated to today. But we aren't just a part of the Methodists that made us possible in the past. We're a part of the 12.5 million United Methodists around the world. The only Christian denomination with more is the Roman Catholic Church. We add our efforts as a congregation to the efforts of all other United Methodists to maintain one of the largest educational systems, one of the largest healthcare systems, one of the largest church systems in the world. Our contributions. Here are my contributions, what we put in the plate or send through the mail if you're like Candace and me. Helps maintain schools in Nepal and Guatemala and other nations around the world. It helps support hospitals in Haiti and the Philippines and many other nations around the world. And in return, we are supported by the Connection that helps us find our way through all of the legalities that kill hundreds of other denominations because they aren't a part of a connection. We're a part of a connection where a pastor was serving First United Methodist Church of Tacoma when they had a new building and needed a lot of furniture, and they needed chairs for their feeding program. And I found out the Summit United Methodist Church had 100 metal folding chairs that they didn't need. So my father-in-law took his van out there and picked up those chairs. That pastor is now pastor of Grace United Methodist Church, and he had a vision that it would be nice to get rid of these choir pews and put in some nice cushy sanctuary type chairs. And he just happened to know the First United Methodist Church in Tacoma has 60 some of those chairs stored underneath a stairwell because they accidentally ordered way too many when they moved into their new building. So he called down, and their council said Tuesday night, sure, you can have 10 of our chairs. Come on down and get them. And I went down and got them. And because I went down and got them, I got the flyer on this guy speaking about the African roots of religion. We're connected, friends. We aren't alone. And in recent years, Grace Church has lost some of the connections we had. We used to have some members that were highly involved in the annual conference, and we're not doing that so much more. But we will benefit if we do, if we strengthen those connections. We're going to build a tiny house here in a few months. We're going to have a member of University Temple United Methodist Church come down, and he's going to give us the materials list and help us get all of the materials. And we're going to spend 2 weeks building a tiny house on the parking lot. I wanted to do it on the lawn, but it has to be where the Low Income Housing Institute can come and pick it up and haul it away to a tiny house community. We're going to do that in cooperation with another layperson in another church. But it will help us achieve our goal of addressing the horrible issue of homelessness in the city of Seattle. But to fill our dream, we have to make room for the future. We have to make room for the future. We have to be able to let go of some of the past. Elisha couldn't have been the prophet if he hadn't allowed Elijah to be carried away. And so the trustees took a bold step this week. They said that we have 2 pianos in this building that are unusable. Let's let them go. And we have an organ downstairs that is unusable. Let's let it go. And we have a 4-drawer file cabinet, and we have a shopping cart. Does anyone need a shopping cart? We have one available. Let's let them go. We need to let go of some of the stuff of the past so that we're ready to receive the stuff of the future. God doesn't like unused resources. And as God's prophet, I don't like unused resources. That's why I got the chairs from the Summit Church to the Tacoma Church, and the chairs from the Tacoma Church to the Grace Church, and we're going to get the little house from our church to the people of God who are living on the streets. If we're going to build God's kingdom on earth, we need to make room for it. Black History Month is important. Black History Month is important not for a month, but year-round. Amen. Decade-long. Eternity. It's important to fuel the dreams and the shapes and the expectations of all people. and I say all people, it is as important for the white child to know black history as it is for the black child. Because the expectations of both are formed by what they know of the world that has been. Black History Month is the foundation upon which we as a congregation will build a future. A future that infuses United Methodism and eventually all of humanity with distinctively black spirituality and black power. A future that transcends the lines of division and builds a world of peace. Black history is a part of the foundation that will allow God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let's build it, friends. Let's build it. Amen. Pastor Larry, in the early church, Christians were so few and far between that when a visiting pastor came from another place, that pastor was always given an opportunity to say something they wanted to hear.